Hello again. This is going to be a bit of a different video than usual. Basically, there's this movie that I've been dying to talk about called Project Hail Mary. Now, if you're a sci-fi nerd, you might recognize that name because it was the name of a best-selling book that the movie is based off of. For those of you who have read the book, you know exactly what's going to happen in the movie. For those of you who don't worry about it. I'm not doing any spoilers here. I will first do a quick summary of the movie just for people who don't understand what it's about, and then I'll go into what I think the movie does well, what I think the movie does not do very well, or rather, what are some of its limitations, and then kind of impressions on where this is taking kind of the sci-fi genre and what can we learn about this to improve the image of science. Like my channel a lot of the time is just a voice of science a little bit. It's trying to be science communications as much as it can. And I would like to see how can we take this idea of what we see in Project Hail Mary and make it a science communication thing, because I do think that it succeeds at communicating science very well. So to get into it, the summary is kind of the following. We have our main character called Grace, or Dr. Grace, played by Ryan Gosling. At the beginning of the movie, he is a middle school science teacher, or like a high school science teacher. I don't think it's ever specified. And at one point, he gets recruited to a top secret big scientific operation to try and save the world. Now, said scientific problem is that there are these bacteria in the movie that are called astrophages, and they eat infrared light and then reproduce from eating the infrared light. And they can survive in like the most horrid of conditions, including the surface of the sun. So what they've started doing is that they're eating the red light, they're reproducing on the surface of the sun, and they threaten to block out enough light going to the Earth from the sun to cause super climate cooling and kill off like a bunch of plants and animals that we need to survive. And so all the smart science people get together, they do some experiments, they figure out what the astrophage is, and I'll get into the experiments later specifically because I think this is where they demonstrate that science is not magic, unlike what most movies try and make it out to be. But they do a bunch of experiments. They determine that the only thing they can do is to get a group of 3 people, a scientist, an engineer, and a pilot, on a spaceship and send them to another star system who has astrophages but for some reason has not died out yet or whose star is not infected yet. And they do that. Grace is one of those 3. He's the scientist. And it turns out that he is the only one who survives the way there. Then there he encounters another spaceship, not human, of an alien race. There he calls the specific alien Rocky. I don't know if there's a term for all the aliens, but I'll just call them like rock dogs, because that's what they are. They're like a, I mean, they're not dogs. They call them dogs just to like insult their intellect, but that's what they look like. And there's this moment of like Grace meeting Rocky and trying to communicate with him. Of course, these are completely different languages, completely different beings, not based on the same thing, which again I'll get into later. And the whole idea is that they together try and figure out a way to kill all the astrophages, or at least control the astrophages so that they don't eat the stars in both star systems, in both the solar system and in whatever Rocky system, again, I forget the name. The antagonist in this context is technically the astrophages, but also all the stuff they have to do in order to be able to do the science on the astrophages and how difficult that is for them. So this is the general gist of the movie. I think this is a good attempt, a solid attempt at demonstrating what science is actually like and what scientists actually do. Too often in movies we see people have a scientist in their group and they're like, we have this problem, and then somebody else in the group is like, just give it to the scientist, and the scientist takes away the problem and comes back with a solution, and it's not shown what he does, but it's always a solution, it's always quick, it's always easy. Science is basically magic in movies. Like, for all intents and purposes, you could always replace the scientist with a wizard and just have the wizard say a spell and solve the problem. Because most movies cannot be bothered to explain the science or even try and, like, pretend that there is some sort of science. It's just kind of like, use the force. It's the same thing. The force could be the scientist. It doesn't matter. But I think this does it a lot better. So the first thing that caught my eye when I was watching the movies, there's this part where the reason that they recruit Grace is because he wrote a paper for his doctorate where he said that life is not necessarily based on water, like that there could theoretically be life without water. And when you hear that in the movie, then you presume automatically, like, oh, they're getting him because he was right and he's against the establishment and all this. And he's the only guy who knew it all along and he's special or something. Which is kind of how science is often portrayed in a lot of media, is that there was that one guy who was like against everybody else and he was right in the end. And I think that's bred a lot of conspiracy theory shit. But what this movie does good is one of the first things that happens, they recruit him for that, and he's experimenting on the astrophage. The first thing he determines is that it's like 99% water. Now, the water itself doesn't matter in the science, in this context, like the science facts don't really matter. It's this idea of like, yeah, you don't have to be the one singular guy against everyone to change things in science. He determines that it's 99% water, and then he continues doing experiments until he finds something interesting, because that is how science works. And anybody who has done research before will know this. One of the problems I had with that scene, however, is that for some reason, he was like the only guy in the lab, and then there was a bunch of people looking at him doing the experiments. I thought that was weird. That doesn't usually happen in science. Maybe it does in these secret CIA something projects, who knows? Um, but usually in science, it's a group of people. You don't tend to have any, like, direct military observation. Not the way they showed it in the movie. I think the reason they did it in the movie is just for shits and giggles. Which, another thing, this is a Ryan Gosling movie. If you're expecting this to be like The Martian was quite serious. Like, it had jokes here and there, but at the end of the day, it was quite serious. This is objectively a comedy. Like, it has some tragic moments that I won't get into because there's, spoilers. But in general, this is a comedy. Seriously, props to Ryan Gosling. Like, he carries the movie. He's basically the only actor for most of it. And the guy just carries it with just really good charisma, and I think a lot of the jokes are funny, especially if you're into sci-fi and into science. I think they're really funny. So fast forward a little bit, I think also his first interaction with Rocky or the alien is also very, very interesting. Because the first way that they communicate is through material. Rocky can basically kind of make anything, and he is a little bit of magic because he's an alien, so of course he's magic. But he can just create things, and he creates a replica of Grace and a replica of his ship, and then he's talking, and well, he's not talking, he's just showing him things, and Grace is making conclusions based off of that. And I think that's great because that's probably one of the ways that languages start. And it made it all seem very realistic, made you very engaged in the communication between the two. The second thing that I found interesting was that the language begins as imitation of one another. Again, this is done through a kind of comedic, almost skit-like thing where Grace starts dancing and then Rocky starts imitating him. I'm not sure if people danced when they were inventing language, but this is one of the ways that people think that language got invented was mimicry. Because at the end of the day, what language is doing is that if I'm saying a word or even a sound, you only know what that means because we all mimic each other. And somebody decided at the beginning this is what it means, but it's all mimicking sounds. Language is just the reproduction of the same sounds over and over again. And learning a language a lot of the time is just repeating sounds, even if you don't know their meaning. In this context, this is not sounds, but motion. So I think that was really good. Unfortunately, as a sci-fi person, I think it was a little too fast, though, how they went from that to full-on talking to each other. They also put quite a focus on the fact that Rocky and Grace are working together on everything. Um, and I think this is a very good portrayal of what science is like, because it's usually not just like one guy. Um, Not only just one guy who's against everyone, but it's usually not the one scientist. Every great scientist since the Second World probably has a big team behind them. Another moment that I think is a good representation of science is that whenever they're doing experiments, it's always kind of improvised and ad hoc, and that actually kind of makes sense. Science is often portrayed as this like super clean, super high tech thing, um, but while it is clean, it doesn't have to be super high tech. For example, when he's doing experiments with the astrophages at the beginning, he actually does the first experiment in what is basically a big wooden box with a bunch of different metals. And I mean, they explain it better in the movie, but it is basically a cardboard, wood, and metal project that he just kind of tapes together. This makes sense for a lot of science. Like, if you go to a lot of research labs, sure, in some of them, when they're doing very, very, very specific things, you'll find highly optimized technology that is looking at the highest of detail, especially if you're doing something like molecular or particle physics or chemistry or molecular biology. You'll see some very, very, very high tech shit. But for a lot of other experiments, you don't necessarily need that. Especially if you're trying to start from zero, basically, where you have something like the astrophage, which is a complete unknown, and you're just trying to experiment. A good example of this, I think, would be the kind of evolution of the atom that we saw, where you have like all the different models. So you have like the Dalton, then the Thomson, then the Rutherford, then the Bohr, and then finally the Schrodinger. Like all of those are relatively not low effort experiments, but relatively improvised ad hoc experiments. Like one of them is literally done with just a single strand of gold and then shooting alpha particles. For me, and I will once again say this without spoilers, and those who will have seen the movie will understand me. I believe that the end was a little too drawn out. I think it's a little too meta. It's like it's trying to make you think of a certain ending and then tricking you like a few times on what the actual ending is. And to me, this is because I think the first 75% of the book, and for me, this happens because I think something like the first 60% of the book was the first 90% of the movie, while the last 40% of the book was like the last 10%. Ooh, another amazing moment. The alien, even though a lot of the time it seems more advanced than magic, they go out of their way to show that there is science that we have that the alien does not. And I think this is really accurate to what it would be like to actually find an alien species and actually talk to them. For example, I think the thing that they didn't know was radiation. Like they didn't have the concept for radiation. Also because they echolocate, so that could be a reason for it. I don't exactly know. But the reason that Rocky is also stranded there is because the rest of his crew dies due to radiation. And it's like you don't need radiation in order to build a rocket. Not really. Though I do think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that you have this intergalactic species that somehow never thought about decay. Or I guess even the electromagnetic spectrum, which does make a bit of a plot hole, since the astrophages are powered by infrared radiation. And that's literally right there on the spectrum. Maybe they just thought gamma wasn't that special. Who knows? But I think it serves its purpose to show that even though we think we're like the shit in science, right? We are probably missing a lot of stuff that another species will look at as super obvious, like we look at radiation as today. And to kind of conclude, I think all these things that I've pointed out could be very easily adapted to other shows, as well as just the portrayal of science and fiction in general. I think the kind of cliche character, scientist, the one guy in the group, the one I said who acts like a wizard, is at the end of the day a little detrimental to science. And it would be interesting to see if we can switch that with something that makes more sense and that is more realistic, while keeping all the good fiction we've written so far as enticing as it is. But yeah, I think that's all I really have to say about that. I give it a solid 7 out of 10 on the science, knowing full well that if it was 10 out of 10 on science, it would be a documentary and boring as shit. I recommend you watch it, especially if you're somebody who's into physics or biology, because those are the two sciences that are most relevant to the whole thing. So yeah, Project Hail Mary, goated movie, love Ryan Gosling. Have a great day.